He strode aft, jostling Block, who turned very pale and made no answer on one side, and seizing the helm gave the word in a firm voice, "Hard a lee!" The men flew to their posts, and the ship went cleverly about. All this had occupied nearly 5 minutes, and it was supposed to be hardly within the bounds of possibility that any individual could be saved, allowing any to have been on board the boat. Yet, as the reader has seen, both Augustus and myself were rescued, and our deliverance seemed to have been brought on by about 2 of these almost inconceivable pieces of good fortune, which are attributed by the wise and pious to the special interference of Providence. While the ship was yet in stays, the mate lowered the jolly boat and jumped into her with the very 2 men, I believe, who spoke up as having seen me at their helm. They had just left the lee of the vessel, the moon still shining brightly, when she made a long and heavy roll to the windward, and Henderson, at the same moment, starting up from his seat, bawled out to his crew of backwater, who would say nothing else, repeating his cry impatiently, "Backwater, backwater!" The men would put back as speedily as possible, but by this time the ship had gone around and gotten fully under headway, although all hands on board were making great exertions to take in sail. In spite of the danger of the attempt, the mate clung to the main chains as soon as they came within his reach. Another huge lurch now brought the starboard side of the vessel out of the water nearly as far as her keel, when the cause of his anxiety was rendered obvious enough. The body of a man was seen to be affixed in the most singular manner to the smooth and shining bottom. The penguin was coppered and copper fastened, and beating violently against it with every movement of the hull. After several ineffectual efforts made during the lurches of the ship, and at the immediate risk of swamping the boat, I was finally disengaged from my perilous situation and taken on board, for the body proved to be my own. It appeared that one of the timber bolts, having started and broken a passage through the copper, it had arrested my progress as I passed under the ship, and fastened me in so extraordinary a manner to her bottom. The head of the bolt had made its way through the collar of the green baize jacket I had on, and through the back part of my neck, forcing itself out between 2 sinews just below my right ear. I was put immediately to bed, although life seemed to be totally extinct. There was no surgeon on board. The captain, however, treated me with every attention, to make amends, I presume, in the eyes of his crew, for its atrocious behavior in the previous portion of the adventure. In the meantime, Henderson had again put off from the ship, although the wind was now blowing almost a hurricane. He had not been gone many minutes when he fell in with some fragments of our boat. And shortly afterward, one of the men with him had asserted that he could distinguish a cry for help at intervals amid the roaring of the tempest. This had induced the hardy seamen to persevere in their search for more than half an hour, although repeated signals to return were made by them by Captain Block, and although every moment on the water in so frail a boat was fraught to them with the most imminent and deadly peril. Indeed, it is nearly impossible to conceive how the small jolly they were in could have escaped destruction for a single instant. She was built, however, for the whaling service, and was fitted, as I have since reason to believe, with air boxes, in the manner of some lifeboats used on the coast of Wales. After searching in vain for about the period of time just mentioned, it was determined to get back to the ship. It had scarcely made this resolve when a feeble cry arose from a dark object that floated rapidly by. They pursued and soon overtook it. It proved to be the entire deck of the airless cuddy. Augustus was struggling near it, apparently in the last agonies. Upon getting hold of him, it was found that he was attached to a rope to the floating timber. This rope, it will be remembered, I had tied myself around his waist and made fast to a ring bolt for the purpose of keeping him in an upright position. In my so doing, it appeared, had been ultimately the means of preserving his life. The aerial was slightly put together, and in going down, her frame naturally went to pieces. The deck of the cuddy, as might have been expected, was lifted by the force of the water rushing in entirely from the main timbers and floated with other fragments, no doubt, to the surface. Augustus was buoyed up with it and thus escaped a terrible death. It was more than an hour after being taken on board the Penguin before he could give any account of himself or be made to comprehend the nature of his accident which had befallen our boat. At length he became thoroughly aroused and spoke much of his sensations while in the water. Upon his first attaining any degree of consciousness, he found himself beneath the surface, whirling round and round with inconceivable rapidity, and with a rope round and 3 or 4 folds tightly about his neck. In an instant afterward, he felt himself going rapidly upward, when his head striking violently against a hard substance, he again relapsed into insensibility. Upon once more reviving, he was in fuller possession of his reason. This was still, however, in the greatest degree clouded and confused. He now knew that some accident had occurred and that he was in the water, although his mouth was above the surface, and he could breathe with some freedom. Possibly at this period of the deck was drifting rapidly before the wind and drawing him after it as he floated upon his back. Of course, as long as he could have retained in this position, it would have been nearly impossible that he should be drowned. Presently, a surge threw him directly athwart the deck, and this post he endeavored to maintain, screaming his intervals for help. Just before he was discovered by Mr. Henderson, he had been obliged to relax his hold through exhaustion, and falling into the sea, had given himself up for lost. During the whole period of his struggles, he had not the faintest recollection of Ariel, nor of any matters in connection with the source of his disaster. A vague feeling of terror and despair had taken his entire possession of his faculties. When he was finally picked up, every power of his mind had failed him, and as before said, it was nearly an hour after getting on board the Penguin before he became fully aware of his condition. In regard to myself, I was resuscitated from a state bordering merely nearly upon death, and after every other means had been tried in vain for 3 hours and a half. By vigorous friction with flannels bathed in hot oil, a proceeding suggested by Augustus, the wound in my neck, although of an ugly appearance, proved of little real consequence, and I soon recovered from its effects. The Penguin got into port about 9 o'clock in the morning after encountering one of the severest gales ever experienced off Nantucket. Both Augustus and myself managed to appear at Mr. Barnard's in time for breakfast, which luckily was somewhat late, owing to the party overnight. I suppose at the table they were much too fatigued themselves to notice our jaded appearance. Of course, it would not have borne a very rigid scrutiny. Schoolboys, however, can accomplish wonders in ways of deception. And I verily believe not one of our friends in Nantucket had the slightest suspicion that the terrible story by some sailors in town of having their run down a vessel at sea and drowned some 30 or 40 poor devils had reference to either the Ariel, my companion, or myself. We two have since very frequently talked the matter over, but never without a shudder. In one of our conversations, Augustus frankly confessed to me that in his whole life he had never, at no time, experienced so excruciatingly a sense of dismay as when on board our little boat he first discovered the extent of his intoxication and felt himself sinking beneath its influence. In no affairs of mere prejudice, pro or con, do we deduce our inferences with entire certainty, even from the most simple data. It might be supposed that a catastrophe such as I have just related would have effectively cooled my insipid passion for the sea. On the contrary, I never experienced a more ardent longing for the wild adventures incident to the life of a navigator than within the week after our miraculous deliverance. The short period proved amply long enough to erase from my memory the shadows and bring out the vivid light all the pleasurably exciting points of color, all the picturesqueness of the late perilous accident. conversations with Augustus grew daily more frequent and more intensely full of interest. He had a manner of relating his stories of the ocean, more than one half of which I now suspect to have been sheer fabrications, well adapted to wait with one of my enthusiastic temperament, and somewhat gloomy, although glowing, imagination. It is strange, too, that he most strongly enlisted my feelings in behalf of the life of a seaman when he depicted his more terrible moments of suffering and despair. For the bright side of painting, I had a limited sympathy. My visions were of a shipwreck and famine, of death, of captivity among barbarian hordes, of a lifetime dragged out in sorrow and tears upon some gray and desolate rock, in an ocean unapproachable and unknown. Such visions or desires, for they amounted to desires, are common, as I have since been assured, to the whole numerous race of melancholy among men. At the time of which I speak, I regarded them as only prophetic glimpses of a destiny which I felt myself in a measure bound to fulfill. Augustus thoroughly entered into my state of mind. It is probable, indeed, that our intimate communion had resulted in a partial interchange of character. About 18 months after the period of Ariel's disaster, the firm of Lloyd and Vredenburgh, a house connected with the manors in some manner with the Messrs. Enderby, I believe, of Liverpool, were engaged in repairing and fitting out the brig Grampus for a whaling voyage. She was an old hulk, and scarcely seaworthy when all was done to her that could be done. I hardly know why she was chosen in preference to other vessels, good vessels belonging to the same owners, but so it was. Mr. Barnard was appointed to commander, and Augustus was going with him. While the brig was getting ready, he frequently urged upon me the excellency of the opportunity now offered for indulging my desire of travel. He found me by no means an unwilling listener, yet the matter could not be so easily arranged. My father had made no direct opposition, but my grandfather, from whom I expected much, vowed to cut me off with a shilling if I should ever broach the subject to him again. These difficulties, however, so far from abating my desire, only added fuel to the flame. I determined to go at all hazards, and having made known my intention to Augustus, we set about arranging a plan by which it might be accomplished. In the meantime, I forbore speaking to any of my relations in regard to the voyage. And as I busied myself ostensibly with my usual studies, it was supposed that I had abandoned my design. I have since frequently examined my conduct on this occasion with sentiments of displeasure as well as of surprise. The intense hypocrisy I make use of for the furtherance of my project, a hypocrisy pervading every word and action of my life for so long a period of time, could only have been rendered tolerable to myself by the wild and burning expectation with which I looked forward to the fulfillment of my long-cherished visions of travel. In pursuance of my scheme of deception, I was necessarily obliged to leave much to the management of Augustus, who was employed for the greater part of every cabin on board the Grampus, attending to some arrangements for his father in the cabin hold. At night, however, we were to be sure to have a conference and talk over our hopes. After nearly a month passed in this manner, without our hitting upon any plan we thought likely to succeed, he told me at last he had determined upon everything necessary. I had relations living in New Bedford, a Mr. Ross, at whose house I was in the habit of spending occasionally 2 or 3 weeks at a time. The brig was to sail about the middle of June 1827, and it was agreed that A day or two before her putting to sea, my father was to receive a note, as usual, from Mr. Ross, asking me to come over and spend a fortnight with Robert and Emmett, his sons. Augustus charged himself with the inditing of this note and getting it delivered. Having set out, I suppose, for New Bedford, I was then to report myself to my companion, who would contrive a hiding place for me and the Grampus. The hiding place, he assured me, would be rendered sufficiently comfortable for a residence of many days, during which I was not to make my appearance. When the brig has proceeded so far as to run her courses to make any turning back a matter out of question, I should then, he said, be formally installed in all the comforts of the cabin. And as to my father, he would only laugh heartily at the joke. Vessels enough will be met with by which a letter might be sent home explaining the venture to my parents.